Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next ICPHSO webinar. I'm Chris Harvey. Like our similar webinar we just did not too long ago on the 14th, today's session is a lead-in for the annual symposium, which is occurring next month in Orlando. So this session is Product Safety 101, which includes a global perspective. And I will say, if you're new to product safety, this should give you a good introduction to the topic, which we have a couple of true experts within the field with us today who will introduce in a minute. With that being said, too, if you're a veteran in product safety, I think you can always learn new things as well. So the annual symposium next month, that's going to take a deeper dive into some of the topics that we talk about today. So today, again, a little bit more high level, but then more granular at the symposium. So if you've not registered for that already, I do recommend that you check that out. If you missed the last webinar, which was earlier this month on the annual symposium orientation and the buddy program, I do recommend that you check out the recording. Just go to the ICPHSO.org website, and there is a section for conferences and then webinars. I'll also mention that this session today will also be recorded, so you can rewatch it or you can also share it with colleagues. I'd also like to take a second to recognize the recent passing of Ross Kozer, who was a founding member of ICPHSO. Ross was a former president, and he was also the first executive director of the organization. So Ross, truly a legend in product safety, will definitely be missed. I think sessions like this one, sessions like the symposium occurring in Orlando next month, wouldn't really have had the same scale that we're accustomed to now, based on what Ross did to lay the foundation for that. So more information is available on the ICPHSO website regarding that. All right, so as far as introductions for today's session, I'm Chris Harvey. I am an ICPHSO board member. I am also on the executive committee, currently finishing out a term as treasurer. And then my day job is helping companies execute recalls with Sedgwick. With that, I'm very honored to be joined by Cheryl and Sarah Jane today. I'll have Cheryl, if you want to introduce yourself and get a little background, and then we'll go to Sarah Jane. And then I do have an initial question on product safety that I'll pose for both of you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Cheryl Placenti. For those of you who don't know me, I am a founding partner of the law firm Goldberg Segalla. I wear two hats in my firm. For the most part, I help companies who are dealing with product safety issues or interaction with government officials. But I also have a background for the last 30 years or so as a product liability litigator, as a trial lawyer who deals with lawsuits involving product liability issues. So that gives me a somewhat unique perspective on safety issues, what can go wrong and what can go right. Thanks.
Thanks, Cheryl. Sarah Jane?
Hi, everyone. So my name's Sarah Jane Dobson, and I'm an ICPHSO board member and also a partner and the global head of the product litigation and product safety regulatory team at international law firm Ashurst. I work with a team, a core team of product law experts who day in, day out do only product law issues. And like Cheryl, that's across the product lifecycle, so from launch to litigation. And then I lead a team of about 30 lawyers across our international network who also focus on this topic.
Great. Well, welcome both, and thank you for joining us. A question that I'll pose: how'd you get into product safety, and what does a role in product safety mean to you? Cheryl, I don't know if you want to go first.
Like anything else, doors open. And I started working many years ago with a company that was facing a very large product recall that was going to have national implications. And actually, I came on with the intention of being litigation support after the recall was over. But as a result, I really enjoyed the work. I enjoy working with companies and seeing how they think about product safety and all the things that go into making a safe product that I never realized before. And I really enjoy it as a lawyer, and it gives me definitely a different perspective and much more respect for people who do the work that the ICPHSO members do.
Absolutely. Sarah Jane?
So, Chris, I came slightly more directly in some ways. So, I actually really always loved science. My second degree is actually in science, a Bachelor of Science. And I always knew, though, that even though I loved science, I wanted to be a lawyer. So, I set on the mission of trying to accomplish both, essentially doing an area of law that really focused on technical scientific issues. And I started off in a couple of different areas like IP or medical negligence. But when I came across product safety and product liability very early in my training contract in Australia, I absolutely fell in love with it. And it's been an area that I've done ever since. And I think it's the intersection between the technical aspect, which we'll talk about later, is very much, as we all know, the bedrock of what we do, layered with the legal complexities and the legal knotty questions that we get on a daily basis that I really enjoy still to this day.
I'm sure that science thinking helps in what you do, gives it a good perspective. So thank you both. So just to set the stage for the agenda, Cheryl and Sarah Jane are going to share some of their insights and perspectives based on their geographical areas. I'll throw out some questions to them to keep it conversational throughout, and then we'll definitely have some at the end. As far as audience members, your lines are muted, but you can ask questions into the chat module. So just type that in. I may try to throw those out throughout the session or just wait till the end, but we'll definitely save some time to address some of those questions. I'll also say if you have other examples or other insights, feel free to throw those into the chat module as well. So with that, Cheryl, we'll go ahead and dive in and we'll pull up your slides.
Thanks, Chris. I thought I'd start with the product life cycle. A lot of companies have different forms of this type of cycle. Sometimes there are 5 elements, sometimes there are 15 or 25 elements, but the basic idea is the same. Product development generally starts with an idea, and then that idea is researched and validated, and people look at competitors' products. Companies look to see if people really want the product. Then it goes on to seeing what the product really needs, what kind of specifications, what kind of regulations are applicable to the product, what do we have to comply with, how do we make a good product, and then that concept is tested. Either a prototype is made or focus groups are brought in to interact with the product. Then the product is produced. That's a very large part of product production, is looking for somebody who can make it, who can make a quality product, who can consistently make a product of the same quality and safety. Then the product is marketed and brought out to the public, introduced to vendors, introduced to retailers. Then it's very important that a company continue to monitor how the public is interacting with the product, gather feedback either through their own customer or consumer resource or services department, or through online reviews, or through government feedback. And then the process of improving the product or correcting any issues occurs, and either a new product or a new version is introduced. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that we generally think of product safety at the ICPHSO conference as conducting recalls and paying attention to consumer feedback, but all throughout this cycle, there are so many professionals and experts within a company that are providing their feedback, providing their input, providing their ideas to make sure that the product is safe. And the job of the people who are doing either the litigation or the consumer affairs feedback is made a lot easier when the people who are interacting with or contributing to the concept and the testing and the engineering of the product have done their job. We look at the next slide, please.
Yeah, and just to stay here real quick, I have a question.
Sure.
Cheryl, from your perspective, and I think this is important, like you mentioned before, I think lot of people think of product safety on the back end when something wrong has happened, and product culture, safety culture, it needs to start throughout this. But where do you typically see companies fail most in this circle? Is that the feedback stage? Is it somewhere else?
Well, from my perspective, ignoring feedback can be fatal. But then again, that's because most of the companies I work with have taken the care all the way through to make sure that there isn't some major flaw with the product. There isn't some major issue that it will be developing soon. There isn't some major, failure of compliance with a known standard or a standard that might be applicable. So from my perspective, if everyone else does their job, paying attention to feedback will add that extra layer of protection. Ignoring feedback can be easy to do because it's such a mass amount of information to be synthesized. But ignoring feedback can be fatal because once a product is in the market and once a product has been shown to have a certain amount of problems with it that have been ignored, you might as well have not made the product to begin with if it has to be completely recalled and if everything like it has to be recalled.
Yeah, and I think too, hopefully emerging technologies like AI can help with, as you mentioned before, there's a lot of data out there. So hopefully maybe the AI can help look at the data and identify hazards and defects earlier on. I think we'll see how companies look at that and how they implement it to help that process there. Yeah. I do want to, Sarah Jane, I'll ask you real quick too. Do you see a similar circle internationally too?
Absolutely, Chris. So as I was saying, the practice that my team and I engage in is very much across the full circle. And I'm finding more and more that it's necessary to be across that full circle because increasingly there's a link between product compliance at the very front of launching a product, as Cheryl was just talking about, and then the back end of things, product liability. In particular, there's been some reforms in the EU, which are likely to be mirrored in the UK, which really speak to that very direct link between essentially a non-compliance or a recall. Although it was implicit before, now it's expressed that will assume a defect for the purposes of a product liability civil suit afterwards. So we very much operate across that full life cycle, and companies are now more cognizant of the connections between them. And as Cheryl was saying, I think people are spending a lot of time making sure they get it right at the very beginning, because it really does pay dividends. And a lot of companies say to me, particularly if they're in an earlier stage or a startup phase, are you sure we have to put all this effort and time and cost into the beginning? And I can tell them, the cost of litigation at the end of it is much more costly, and the reputational damage. And the fact that people want to get it right at the beginning, I think is a good incentive. But we do very much see this circle.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, if we can go to the next slide. We go, Cheryl.
I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the agencies other than the Consumer Product Safety Commission that might have a hand in or some say about the safety of a product. We generally think about the CPSC at ICPHSO. It's the International Consumer, it's a consumer product oriented organization, but it's not uncommon for some of the products that some of our member companies make to be regulated by other agencies, or to have some other agency have some kind of say in whether the product should be recalled or the standards that a product has to be compliant with. We go to the next slide, please. One of the things I want to mention is that oftentimes when a company is facing either a request for a recall or a lawsuit, they'll come to me and say, "Oh, don't worry about this. Our product is tested to very high standards, and we rigorously and frequently test the product, and it certainly meets all of the standards. So we're going to win this. Everything is going to be okay." We really have to keep in mind that adhering to a mandatory standard is the minimum that a product has to do in order to be sold in the US. And even if that's a voluntary standard, most retailers will not accept a product for sale unless it meets the voluntary standards. So there are a lot of very, very stringent standards that apply to many consumer products and many other products, but that adherence is not something that's going to win the day either in a lawsuit or in a recall. But if the product violates any of those standards, certainly a mandatory standard, but even a voluntary standard, that's going to be fatal to an outcome. It's very difficult to litigate a lawsuit if there's a voluntary standard and the product does not adhere to it. So a lot of times, I know some companies outside the US will mention a standard and say it's only a voluntary standard. Voluntary, you can picture that word in air quotes. Voluntary does not really mean voluntary when it comes to product standards. See the next slide, please. As I said, the CPSC is the agency that will have jurisdiction over most of the products that the ICPHSO members produce. It's an independent agency. It regulates about 15,000 consumer products. That's the statistics that's often thrown out. But virtually anything that's used in a school or home by consumers is going to be regulated in some way by the Consumer Product Safety Standard. And that's the one that we generally think of when we're producing consumer products. You certainly have to determine whether there are CPSC standards that would apply to the product. Next slide, please. NHTSA generally regulates motor vehicles, but there are certain things such as motor vehicle equipment or things that can be used in a motor vehicle that NHTSA will have some hand in regulating. One that comes to mind is, for example, car seats. There's a sort of a dual jurisdiction over car seats by NHTSA and the CPSC, because some car seats can be used as an infant carrier. So when the car seat's used as an infant carrier, generally the CPSC regulates it. But when the car seat is used as a protective device in a motor vehicle, NHTSA regulates it. But there are other items, for example, booster cables. You know, the cables that you use when your battery's dead and you need to charge it and you need to get another car to stand next to it and charge your vehicle. Well, there's a question as to whether that product is considered motor vehicle equipment or consumer product. I had the unfortunate occasion where the NHTSA has decided that it did not want to regulate the product because it was not really motor vehicle equipment because it could be used on a boat or on a lawnmower, and the CPSC told me to go look for a recall through NHTSA, and it was very surprising to me. And I'm sure there are other examples that many of the members here could come up with where there's some discussion between the agencies as to who wants jurisdiction. Sometimes the agencies want jurisdiction over a product, and sometimes they actually don't want jurisdiction over a product.
I've seen some no one wants to own it type of scenarios before as well.
Yeah. We go to the next slide, please. The FDA is another agency that has some jurisdictions. I mean, it has primary jurisdiction over medicines and medical devices. But for example, when it comes to the medicine in a bottle, the FDA will regulate it. When it comes to childproofing of the medicine bottle itself, the CPSC has jurisdiction over it. There are other examples also, but it's something to be aware of if you're manufacturing a product that could have that kind of capability.
Yeah, I had a weird one, Cheryl, with knives, and consumer product safety. Well, because of heavy metals within it, it actually ended up being governed by the FDA. So sometimes these things surprise me.
Could we go to the next? The Coast Guard surprised me too. I haven't had personal experience with this, but in doing research a while ago, I learned that if you make a bed that goes in a boat that can sleep certain people, you know, some people have boats that can sleep 6 people, sort of like an RV, the beds that are in the boats are regulated by the Coast Guard, something that you might not expect, but it's something to be aware of, that you have to be thinking about all the possible uses of a consumer product and whether there might be some other government agency that might have a hand in regulating it.
And Cheryl, I'll ask a question that came in through here. There was about what encompasses cosmetics, hair tools, makeup.
Well, when it comes, cosmetics are generally FDA regulated, but I do know that when there are, that the toy standard does have some kind of regulation that I've dealt with when it comes to toy cosmetics, toy lipsticks and things like that. But so generally cosmetics, I would think FDA when we're worrying about what it has to, like a microbial, antimicrobial status and that type of thing.
Yeah, and I think cosmetics too under FDA with it's called MOCRA, Modernization of Cosmetic Regulatory Act. I think
Right.
Definitely more requirements that those manufacturers are faced with it as well.
Could we take the next slide, please? Yes, the FTC regulates communications about products as well as, other things. But when you're making claims about a product, you have to be concerned about what the FTC will permit and not permit. Sometimes in companies, there's a tension between the marketing department and the regulatory department or the legal department as to how far you can go when making claims about what a product can do if the product hasn't been tested to do whatever it supposedly is saying it can do, making claims that a product is superior to some standard or superior to a different product. So the FTC, you certainly have to be concerned about FTC regulations as well. There's a growing number of lawsuits, class action lawsuits associated with claims made by companies. For example, claiming that a food is all natural, or claiming that a product can do certain things, or claiming that a product has certain characteristics. There's a cottage industry, more than a cottage industry, that has developed in places like New York and California, where lawyers are claiming that consumers have been deceived or duped by claims that have been made about a product that are alleged to be false or exaggerated. So it certainly is something that you have to rein in potentially desires of some parts of the organization to make a claim that might not be sustainable. And we can go to the next slide then.
And while we're going to the next slide, Cheryl, just curious too, from all of these agencies, they all undergo product recalls, less known as the Coast Guard, but do the government agencies, do they communicate with each other to benchmark and try to determine best practices and share best practices for recall execution? Have you heard of that before?
I frankly haven't experienced that. And in my experience, the agencies tend to be almost siloed and insular, wanting to tout their own abilities. I'd be happy to hear from anybody else who might have a different experience with that. I think they might learn from each other and try to see what the other agencies are doing. I know, like, for example, the saferproducts.gov database that collects information from consumers and others regarding safety incidents involving consumer products, was modeled on and tried to be like the NHTSA safercars.gov database. It's completely different, but I think agencies like to see what the other ones are doing. But I wouldn't say that they share and collaborate.
Yeah. It seems like a good future ICPHSO panel where you have the FDA, CPSC, NHTSA, USDA all together. That might be tough to get, but it could be really good. So
I would agree.
Yeah. All right, as we go to the next slide, I think, are we transitioning to Sarah Jane, I believe? We still got...
Yeah, The FAA and OSHA, it's just important to know that there are other agencies that do regulate aircraft and equipment used for aircraft, for example, and OSHA will regulate the way equipment is used in the workplace. So if you have a piece of equipment, usually it's not consumer products as much as large scale equipment that's used in the workplace. OSHA would be the organization that would regulate the safety of that equipment, how it's used, how it's maintained, and that type of thing. But we can move on from there. And I think this is one of the earlier.
This might be a repeat if we keep going on the slides. Okay, so I think we'll transition to Sarah Jane. So with that, Sarah Jane, I'll ask you a question. What's the history of development of product safety regimes in the EU and UK to date?
Sure, Chris. So it's fascinating hearing what Cheryl says about the complexity of the overlapping regulators, because I think on the flip side, the EU and the UK more have a complexity in respect of the regimes that fit together. So there's complexities in both ways, but perhaps in different ways. So the development of the system that exists for product safety and regulating products going to market and their safety actually originated out of very technical standards. So it used to be that each EU member state would have very prescriptive requirements in respect of the technical word-by-word account of what is needed in terms of having a safe product in respect of each type of consumer product category. And over time, that was seen to be too cumbersome and not uniform enough, because as you can imagine, as we know, technical issues are subject to interpretation as well. And that was found to be too disparate across the EU, for example, which at that time included the UK, of course. So over time, we moved from what was known as the old approach, the old legislative approach in the EU, to what's now known as the new legislative approach, which is what we know today, essentially, which is the modern product safety regime, which is based really, the legal regime is based on very high level general principles being set out in legislation, and that being underpinned by more granular requirements in other different sources, be that in particular technical standards, but also in respect of statutory guidance and other secondary sources that can be used to interpret that law. And underlying all that is the presumption of conformity, which might come from someone adhering to certain steps, including under technical standards, for example. So that's the system that we know today, and it did have its beginnings in a very much more granular system that's now moved to a broader brush system with some of the granular requirements elsewhere.
Got it. So as we move to the next slide, what's the overall structure of these product safety regimes in the EU, UK, but also Australia?
Sure. So I'll tackle the EU and the UK. Obviously, we've had the B word, Brexit. So there is a change in respect of what we see now. But I'll start with the EU and where we are today. So as I was saying, it's quite a regulated system in the sense that it's got a regular structure to it. So essentially what we have is sector-specific or industry-specific pieces of legislation which have been designed with certain product categories in mind that really are looking at addressing very specific risks in respect of certain products, on the basis that it's known that certain product categories will always have certain unique risks inherent in them. And on that basis, taking those who are producing those products through a set of requirements or conformity assessment tests to make sure that the products that they are selling are safe for sale, essentially. So you can see here, there's some examples there. Toys is a good one that Cheryl also mentioned. Obviously, there's very specific risks given the users of toys, and electronic equipment is another example with the low voltage directive there that you see. Essentially, what should happen is that you look at the more specific legislation first, because as I said, it's designed for that purpose of addressing a particular risk. To the extent there's a gap or there's something that's not covered by that piece of legislation, we then have a overarching piece of legislation known as the General Product Safety It used to be the directive, now the regulation of the 13th of December last year coming into effect in the EU. And essentially that does what it says on the tin, Chris. It essentially plugs any gaps, and it provides a general safety requirement for products within the EU. So no product should be without any regulation in some respects, because it will be captured by the general product safety regulation. And sometimes those regimes interact. So for example, it may be that certain regimes have don't have a reporting obligation to regulatory authorities. Often they do have corrective action obligations, but they may not have that either. But that's always contained in the general product safety regulation. So there'll always be a need for corrective action, i.e. a recall and or a regulatory reporting issue if that's been triggered as part of a production of any type of product. And then outside that, you have some regimes that are specific and don't necessarily interact in the same way as I've mentioned with the general product safety regime. So you can see those examples are very granular, and that's probably why it's much more contained in terms of the regulators, unlike what the fascinating situation Cheryl was mentioning. Although the Coast Guards would be fun to get involved in this system, I'm sure. There's more discrete topics as to what's being regulated by whom in the EU.
Do you think companies are ready for GPSR?
It's a good question, Chris. It's a really big change. And for those who don't know, as I've just mentioned, the GPSRD is such a seminal piece of legislation in the EU. It underpins everything. And as Chris has just said, it's undergone a comprehensive amendment coming into effect at the end of last year, which essentially changes the reporting trigger. It increases liability for different product categories, who's responsible for those, and it really fundamentally changes the landscape of the product safety regime. And Chris, from my experience working with clients, despite doing their best, it's a lot, it's a big change, and it's particularly in the regulatory reporting space, it's a very, very different world where we've moved from what's such a well-regarded system of a risk-based approach to an accident or incident-based approach. That's a different world. So it's hard for everyone to be prepared. I guess it remains to be seen when people have accidents or incidents, Chris, as to how prepared industry is.
Yeah, very true. Yep.
So what I've just described is the EU, and as I said, until recently, the UK had retained the EU position after Brexit. Recently, the UK had been looking at their own legislation and undertaking a consultation, and after a long consultation period, has recently produced draft legislation in the form of a bill that's currently working through the legislative process, which is designed to be the UK specific legislation. Some of you may remember that initially post-Brexit, there was the reference to the UK CA mark, which was designed to replicate the CE mark at the EU level. That was quickly drawn back and the position changed, except for very specific products where that rule for the UK CA mark remains, like construction products is a good example, and medical devices for that matter. And now the UK has actually done something different, and essentially, based on its consultation, decided that it's going to really have a targeted deregulation approach where it's looking at risk-based products and deciding that to the extent that it's going to regulate fully and back that up with enforcement, which is different to what the EU has done, which is a proliferation of legislation, as you've just said, as well as an amendment of its mainstay legislation. So at the moment, the UK still has working through the bill that has been proposed for the main piece of product safety legislation, which would replace the general product safety regime. And that has very different definitions of what a product is than the EU version. Frankly, it's much narrower currently, but it remains to be seen what the final version is. And it has quite interesting concepts such as component manufacturer liability and responsibility, rather, which isn't necessarily directly in the general product safety regime we see at the EU. So it's a really interesting time, Chris, for companies who are operating in both markets that are so geographically close, but in some ways not close in practice. And then if we go to the next slide, I think, well, that some of the concepts in the EU and the UK regimes that are very important, and I'm sure depending on how familiar you are with product safety, these are all very common phrases, but the trigger for most obligations is placing on the market, making the product available, product, consumer, what is safe, what is a safe product, and the notion of intended use and reasonably foreseeable misuse are at the bedrock of the EU and UK systems still. As I mentioned, risk used to be, really, I would argue, particularly in a recall space, the absolute most important concept. In the EU and the UK, there's this unique system of performing what's called a post-market risk assessment. So if there's an incident or an accident, often you would undertake with a technical expert, either in-house or out of the company itself, you would look at the risk and you would look at probability of harm and the seriousness of that harm and come up with a ranking of where that lies. And that would allow you to make an informed decision about what actions you have to take in respect of consumer-facing actions and also the regulatory reporting obligations you have. There was never any hard and fast rules about a low outcome meaning this or a high outcome meaning that, but it was still considered a very good barometer of what one has to do in terms of guiding commercial and practical decisions being made by responsible companies. That system is called the RAPEX system, the RAPEX risk assessment system in the EU, and in the UK it's called the PRISM system. It's a slightly different system in the UK, which has a few more steps involved in it, which generally takes more into account the product volume that's involved and multiplies the risk based on that product volume. So that tends to be what we're seeing in that space. But with the move away from a fully risk-based assessment for corrective actions and regulatory reporting, it remains to be seen how important that notion of risk remains in practice as we move forward. If we move to the next slide, I think we'll just briefly touch on the Australian regime, if we can move to the slide after that. It is not too dissimilar to what I've described in respect of the EU and the UK. Essentially, we have one piece of federal legislation which gives rise to a number of different obligations, generally for consumer products, and that covers the broad range of all products, much like the GPSR that I've just mentioned. Then there's actually a federal level law that governs a lot of product sectors, as you can see here, and in some instances, particularly relevant to our discussion today, is electrical products tend to be governed at a state level as well. So essentially you can have 3 layers of legislation, and much like the EU and UK system, it's an interoperation where one statute is silent, the other one will have operation. So it's a very multi-layered approach, and there's a lot of regulators involved more in that piece than you would see probably in the EU and the UK.
Got it. And added on to that, so what regulators are involved within these regions you just discussed, Australia, UK, EU?
So let's start with the EU. So in the EU, you essentially have, it's an unusual system because one of the powers that is left to be delegated to the member states in respect of EU harmonized legislation is in fact the enforcement power. So the enforcement authorities in the EU will be at a member state level. It's not typical to have subject matter regulators at a member state level. It's often just a general product safety regulator. There are a few exceptions where there may be specialist branches in certain jurisdictions, like for example, the RED directive. In Germany, there's a specific regulator dedicated to just that, but it's usually a subject matter expert and it's not necessarily a different agency per se. And then, of course, you have, on top of that, EU-wide agencies, I would describe them as, who aren't actually necessarily required to enforce themselves, but who have oversight and who are able to guide the power of the enforcement agencies at a member state level. So for our purposes at ICPHSO, the European Commission is the most important European agency in that regard. They have direct powers in respect of asking questions of member state authorities, compelling member state authorities to take actions. For example, there was just an infringement action against the French authorities by the European Commission in respect of an additional requirement, the Triman logo, that's been enforced in France that isn't seen to be in concert with the idea of harmonized legislation. It's a specific market-specific requirement. So that is the role of the very important role of the European Commission to do that. There are other agencies, EU-wide agencies that also operate, but again, they tend to be for non-consumer products like the European Medicines Agency and the Chemicals Agency as well, who similarly to what I've just described will have some oversight function and will also create soft law in the form of guidance to help those that they're regulating discharge their duties, and also allowing consumers often to understand what is their role and what's the role of the regulator that they're involved with. So the idea of the EU system in terms of regulators is that it's a flat structure. There isn't necessarily a hierarchy other than the European Commission that I've just mentioned. Within the member states, there tends to be a flat structure of a single layer of regulators. That's quite different to the UK. And actually that was different in some ways pre-Brexit, or pre-finalisation of Brexit, I should say. So in the UK, we have day-to-day enforcement of the regulations being undertaken by local authorities, in particular the trading standards authorities in the UK. And that's quite specific. Obviously, it changes by very small geographical area, and there's a number of different trading standards authorities that may be involved in day-to-day enforcement of product safety regulations. But then we do have an overseeing regulator, the Office for Product Safety and Standards, who is the first of its kind in Europe for the reason that I've just said, because it is a hierarchical regulator in the sense that it is overseeing more strategic issues. That was an office that was created in 2018, and people described it, Chris, as a CPSC-like agency for Europe. So it was quite a huge development in the European world of regulators. And as I said, they tend to become involved in more strategic issues that are seen to be market-wide. And in the UK, there may be some interaction with the competition markets authorities, particularly in respect of greenwashing claims, or as Cheryl was describing, misleading claims in respect of product claims, for example. But largely speaking, that structure is quite tight. The OPSS has recently developed a very specific subject matter regulator, the construction product regulator. That, again, is the first of its kind. And that's born out of the Grenfell Tower tragedy and the recognition that there needs to be specific oversight, technical specific oversight in respect of that issue. In Australia, again, attached to these regimes that you see here, there will be a specific regulator attached to those, a subject matter expert regulator. There is actually a regulator in Australia called the Gene Therapy Regulator, which sounds like a very cool regulator to be in, that regulates GMOs. But other than that, the general regulator is the ICPHSO, and they, again, in a similar function to what I've just described for the OPSS, will oversee anything to do with product safety issues. And then we have state-based, territory and state-based regulators that may deal with, as I mentioned, the electrical products that I spoke about. For example, that's usually the Office for Fair Trading, and that would be a state-based regulator. So, for example, if you're dealing with an issue in Sydney, it'll be the New South Wales Fair Trading Office that's dealing with that. And they will interact with the ICPHSO, or that will interact with your requirements that you have with the ICPHSO to speak to that particular regulator.
Got it. So thanks, Cheryl and Sarah Jane. I think this information is really good for some that may not have a lot of experience with product safety. Their head might be spinning a little bit, but that's why you both are around to help them navigate the complexities of this, because it is very complicated. So we're going to take the slides down, and I'm going to do some quick fire questions for both of you. I will remind the audience that they can also enter questions directly into the chat module. So this goes for Cheryl and Sarah Jane, and we touched on this a little bit, Cheryl. What are some recommendations for companies who are monitoring consumer and other feedback for possible product safety issues?
I think primarily the overarching goal is to identify important information out of the sea of information that might be coming in through consumer feedback. It's sometimes difficult to identify an issue. Always in the retrospectoscope, the issue is always there. And when it finally bubbles to the top, you can see that this was developing if you're not paying attention. So I think it's important for companies to set up a formal system for identifying reported incidents or issues that could lead to injury or some kind of other safety issue like fire. And a lot of times companies will tell me, well, we're always monitoring this and everybody's in charge of safety and everybody has to bring this to the attention of the people who can do something about it. But if it's everyone's job, it's nobody's job. So it's as distasteful or as unpleasant as it must be, companies large and small have to have a formal system for elevation of information that comes in that reaches some objective level of potential risk. And there are ways to identify that type of risk, risk, overheating, smoking, fire, that kind of thing, choking incidents, lacerations, any injury that requires some kind of medical treatment, that type of thing that sometimes could be ignored if it's not looked at in context with other information that might be available. So I guess my recommendation would be formally put into place the process that you think is in place to make sure that you're not going to miss anything.
Yeah, good point. Sarah Jane?
So, I mean, just to echo exactly what Cheryl said and to add a few additions to it, I think it's important, as Cheryl said, to have a process once you've identified an issue. So, of course, it's great to be able to catch all the issues, but then with knowledge, you have to be able to have a really well thought out process as to what happens next. In particular, as Cheryl said, the escalation. Does this amount to an incident that's enough to warrant a recall or a corrective action? Does this warrant reporting to the regulatory authorities? So that's an important follow-on piece that people often forget. So they have a really good system to capture the information and then don't know what to do with it when it comes about, which is, as you can imagine, quite stressful for all involved. And I think there also should be a really good customer relations function in essence to make sure that you're getting more information if you need it in order to feed that process I've just described. And the only other thing I'd say, Chris, is to do that not on a granular or siloed approach, but to do that globally, because we all well know that there's different triggers for regulatory reporting and corrective actions across the world, and they're not necessarily just based on incidents or issues that happen in the jurisdiction. So Canada's a very good example. You have a reporting obligation and a corrective action obligation based on overseas incidents. So I think having that, making sure that there's visibility for all those across the world, not just in the place that the incident or the accident or the issue has arisen, is equally important. And managing that globally and taking that into consideration on a global basis once you've decided you're going to take action in a certain jurisdiction as well.
And I think both of you touched a little bit on this, but who all should be involved in the process of evaluating safety issues? I think you mentioned, customer relations, but others, Cheryl, engineers, legal.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point, Chris, because it's not a very popular thing to do within a company to raise an issue that could cause the company to have to report, the company might have to change the product, the company might have to recall the product, and nobody wants to be that person unless it's their job. So I think there has to be somebody who is proud of and charged with possibly identifying bad news. But when it comes to how that decision's being made, I think the consumer affairs, consumer relations representatives are the first line when it comes to identifying issues that might be noticed based on incidents that happen in the field. Of course, if you have a test failure, you have something that's happening in production, that's going to be brought to the attention of the product engineers, the people responsible for production. But when it comes to issues that are brought to the attention of the company through consumers or people who are using the product, consumer relations, I think, is the first line. But there has to be a system to elevate specific types of issues to a decision-making body that I think has to encompass both consumer relations and product engineering, someone who knows about the product, who knows how the product is supposed to operate, what characteristics it has, as well as somebody from regulatory or legal that understands the obligations that might not be pleasant obligations, but understands when it's time to sound the alarm and get the people who are responsible for making these decisions involved.
Yep. Anything to add on that, Sarah Jane?
I mean, my simple answer, Chris, who should be responsible for product safety? Everyone in the organization. I think it starts with the culture of safety being imbued in everyone in the organization. And to Cheryl's point, I think if that comes from an organic message of safety being first, it's much easier for people to do, as Cheryl has said, elevate and raise issues as they exist. And I personally feel, obviously, all of the actors that we've talked about are very important, but there's an increasing importance on the compliance department and their role of getting it 100% correct, or as correct as we can get it, for the reason that we've just discussed. There's such a long tail of issues that are flowing if that's not the case. So I think, it's all well and good for others to step in and do their role, but really it's so important for everyone to speak to each other and understand what they're all doing. One of my favorite parts of the job, Chris, is that I think product safety is a great connector practice. It means that you get to talk to people from different parts of the world. You get to talk to people from different technical backgrounds, be it science or law or regulatory or of government affairs, whatever it may be. And I think if that's the way in which product safety is approached, then it will necessarily be something that isn't shameful or troublesome to have a discussion about and to elevate and act on as needed.
That's why I love ICPHSO so much. It brings all these different stakeholders with different perspectives together.
Exactly.
A question I get probably once a week now, but one that came in the chat as well. Cheryl, I'll direct it at you. I'm interested, Sarah Jane, if you have perspective though. Any thoughts on how the regulatory landscape may change with the new administration?
Well, that's always a touchy subject. In general, a Republican administration is more friendly or lenient on business, and a Democratic administration is more friendly to or lenient to consumers. And I don't want to bring up politics here. I don't think it's appropriate, but I think that's what we have seen over the years. There have been switches back and forth over the last few decades. And the pendulum swing, though, is not, it's a very subtle pendulum swing. It's not something that is dramatic. It might be just a flavoring of the type of remedy that might be permitted under a recall. It's not something that's, I believe, will be changing drastically, nor has it ever changed drastically. I think the changes will be, if any, will be subtle and will not affect what we have to do, what our jobs are.
And do you think it'll have any impact on the rolling out of the e-filing?
I wouldn't think that it would. Wouldn't think, but then that's just my opinion. I wouldn't think that a change in the administration would affect something that is at least ostensibly going to streamline. The purpose is to streamline the type of paperwork that has to be accompanying products. And I don't think that the differences in the administrations would change anything affected for that, but I'd be willing to listen to any other opinion on that.
Sure.
I think the changes are more broad brush rather than granular.
Yeah.
If any.
SJ, anything on your perspective related to that?
Just, Chris, that we're watching with bated breath over here to see what happens, and as Cheryl says, it remains to be seen. All I'd say is that the EU and UK situation is not impervious to political changes as well, but for example, Brexit, and in fact we had a change of government whilst the product safety metrology bill was in process in the legislative process in the UK. And all I can say is that the UK has retained its position as a world leader in product safety, and the bill in the UK continued to go through. I guess just to say that it seems that product safety is such an important issue on the agenda that it tends to be that it's regardless of which political party or which political incentive is driving it, product safety seems to continue to be at the forefront of most people's agendas and to continue to be pushed through for the betterment of society, basically, and consumer protection. So that's the experience we've had from this side.
Yeah. Okay. And for you, Sarah Jane, you went through that, any additional nuances that you can think of from an international standpoint that may differ again from like the US, Canada?
I think just, Chris, at the moment, the EU and the UK in particular, and Australia to a lesser extent, and frankly, the rest of the world as well, there's just so much change happening at the moment, Chris, and there is just a proliferation of legislation. What I'd say the EU is a leader in at the moment is the new technologies piece and the regulation of AI. And that sits complementary and sometimes embedded within the product safety requirements. So I think there's a lot of movement in that space that is unique or different to other parts of the world as we're seeing it. And also the fact that there is two different approaches being taken in the EU and the UK, a proliferation of legislation at the EU level and a slightly different approach being taken at the UK with arguably a really big emphasis on enforcement. I think given the close proximity, as I was saying, it does make it complex for people to navigate, but there is also a way to do so. And I think this new legislation being brought through by the UK is designed to clarify what companies should be doing in that context. But essentially, I mean, we're all seeing a flux and a change, and we have more complex products. So really the EU and the UK and Australia are responding to those types of issues. The only other thing I'd say that more is to do with catching up with the states is the use of the class actions regimes that's been brought in the EU. And that expressly mentions both a breach of product safety regulations as well as a product liability claim as being types of causes of action that should be subject to class actions. That's the first time that's happened in Europe. And if you combine that with the changes that we've seen in the Product Liability Directive, which is the only piece of legislation that officially governs product liability claims in the EU, removing the barrier, the threshold for damages from €500 to nothing, I think we can expect to see quite a rise in class actions. And of course, as I said, it's more catching up with the states, but that's a very big change in the EU UK framework, as well as some additional obligations that apply in respect of disclosure requirements in the context of product liability claims in the EU as well, which I think will have a flow-on effect because they're compliance documents and product safety documents, which will be relevant for the rest of the world, in particular, for example, US cases and regulatory cases and litigation cases as well.
Got it. Okay. And I think we only have a couple more minutes. So I did want to ask, there's one question that came in, but we'll address that offline. Just any final thoughts that you can leave the audience from your perspective, or anything you want to summarize? We'll start with Cheryl first.
I guess what I would add is that, or just emphasize, is that there's no one part of a company or person who is ultimately responsible for product safety, and that it is something that is baked into almost every part of developing and producing a new product, simply because the product's going to fail if it ultimately ends up being unsafe, not just because it's the right thing to do or that it's something that you're required to do. So I think it's important at the conference to look around and engage with people who might not do exactly what you do, but who might play another part in bringing safe products to all of us.
Very great. Sarah Jane?
Just to say, Chris, that product safety is such a pivotal role in modern society. I mean, every day you look at the work you're doing and you can see the consumer products that are being used. It's such a rewarding field. And as Cheryl was saying, it's so multifaceted and so multidimensional that I can't think of a day in all these years I've been practicing where it's been 2 days the same. And as we were saying, Chris, before, you get to talk to so many different people from different jurisdictions and different functions. It's a truly rewarding career, I think. And as you said, ICPHSO completely encapsulates all of those facets of product safety that make product safety what it is. So like Cheryl, I'd encourage everyone who's coming to the symposium to make sure that they essentially make use of that. And really, I'm sure it'll be very evident to see the community around the product safety sphere that's unique and one of the best things about it.
Absolutely. So I do want to thank you both for the discussion today. I also want to thank Matt and Luke on the Sedgwick side for just helping with everything behind the scenes as well. So thank you, Matt Gigg and Luke, for your help. Again, this will be recorded and made available. And if anyone has any questions on the side, feel free to reach out to myself, Cheryl, or Sarah Jane. But thanks everyone for joining, and have a good rest of the day.